the grotesque Mega Drive game look good. And as for Cliffhanger, this is one of the worst side-scrollers on the whole Amiga, seriously. Horrific design, bullshit difficulty and flat-out comedy graphics. This game is a joke. Again, the 16-bit game was bad, but this is so much worse. Still, there is snow in it, so at least it's closer to the source material than Last Action Hero was. It is safe to say that these are, by some distance, the two worst games that Psygnosis ever put their name to. Let's just move on from them. While Psygnosis were doing all this publishing, they were very much in a state of transition. Gradually, they were developing games in-house more and more. While they'd always kept their hand in, development was the main reason why Sony had picked them up. So when we get to the PS1 era, we'll see a lot of that, way more so than publishing. For now, Psygnosis developed a couple of fairly notorious CD-based games in the early 90s, starting with the Mega CD version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which comes complete with many FMV scenes from the movie. Join Jonathan Harker as he goes on a super kick party, playing a little chin music for spiders, bats, all sorts, before finding the Count and kicking his fans right down his throat. It's a worthwhile idea, but the execution just goes to pot, especially when you have to jump over literally anything. Not horrific, but very boring. Microcosm, shown here on the CD32, is interesting. As far as FMV-based CD games go, it's virtually a Rolls Royce. Even the introduction is still good. Production values in general are second to none, especially for early 93. Superbly shot 5-minute intro, actual acting, a soundtrack by Rick Wakeman. It's got the bloody lot. The game itself is a rather odd Space Harrier-esque whale shooter where you're a microorganism in someone's body trying to make them healthy again. It's better than Rex Ronan Experimental Surgeon, I guess, and allows me to reference that game for the second documentary in a row, but the game is kind of average. Hypen's general chatter for the game was huge in 1993, although it didn't take long for the game to become a fact. Amiga Format gave it a high 87% score the first time around, and then followed it up with a what were we thinking 40% upon the game's reissue. Such is the fickle nature of video games. And then there's Novastorm on the Mega CD, which is in the same universe. There's not a lot to say about it. As a game, it's probably better than Microcosm, but the production isn't as memorable, and in the end it is still a poor person's Space Harrier that kind of makes you want to play that game instead. And with that, we're finally ready to start the PlayStation era. Psygnosis finally leave the Amiga behind, having been there from pretty close to the beginning. 10 years of, for the most part, really good games, certainly graphically and gameplay a lot of the time. As mentioned, the PlayStation era will be different. While Psygnosis still published games, this is a time when, for the most part, they actually developed them in-house. And they were still a rather odd studio in many ways. Psygnosis' in-house games always seemed weaker than the ones that they published, but, well, we'll see how it all pans out. Spoiler alert, it panned out pretty freaking well. One thing commonly seems to happen with these 1980s companies that I cover, if they get to the 32-bit era, then they start to flounder and ultimately die. That certainly happened with Ocean and with Sensible Software way back when, because neither made it past this generation. Bullfrog lost Molly and wouldn't last out the generation either, and Ultimate, well, they made it, but they hadn't been Ultimate for a long time. Some companies do struggle, but Psygnosis, yeah, they didn't. Having spent a couple of years after the acquisition getting their shit together for the PlayStation, 1995 signalled the beginning of their second glorious period. You could easily make the case for Psygnosis as Europe's top games company in the 32-bit era. Some sources give them, at various points, responsibility for 40% of all the region's games sold in certain periods of the 32-bit era. Psygnosis rode very high indeed. Several of the most famous games on the PlayStation bear their name. So, time to have a look at some of them. These aren't all of them, not even close, but they are some of the most famous ones. Actually, before anything else, Psygnosis's first contribution to the PS1 wasn't actually a game. They co-created, with SM Systems, Psyche, the original and official SDK for the Sony PlayStation. No biggie, obviously. Just go ahead and create that, the software that everyone else will be using to make their games, get approval from Ken Kutaragi himself in a big bloody meeting, and there you go, no pressure. The big man did approve, and Psyche was right in there. If you're interested in looking, Psyche was whipped onto the internet a long time ago, and so is used by anyone who still happens to make games in the PlayStation homebrew demo scene. But you could surely say that Psygnosis's most important contribution to the PS1 happened right here, well before any games. But of course, there would be lots of games. Psygnosis's first PS1 game features a familiar set of faces. It's 3D Lemmings. All the fun of the original Lemmings, only now in 3D. It's, well, let's be honest, it's rubbish. The controls are as terrible as early 3D gets. You move the camera using the face buttons, and selecting actions involves pressing R1 in some arcane sequence that in 2016 might as well be written out in hieroglyphics. It's such a confusing and baffling game that I couldn't even get through the first level of fun. Now, I am admittedly bad at Lemmings, but not that bad. Maybe if it had been made a couple of years later when people understood better how to design controls for a 3D game, it would have been decent. But the game is ruined by bad, so bad early 3D game controls. Plus, I just get the feeling that Lemmings, much like Worms, doesn't work in 3D. It should be a 2D game, and sticking it in 3D makes it overcomplicated and rubbish. There would not be a 3D Lemmings 2. However, Psygnosis's next game would be altogether a different matter. It's the original Wipeout. Both the original and its even more famous sequel, Wipeout 2097, did a big job of selling the PlayStation over here, and selling the PlayStation's all-new adult image of being a console for day-job night-smashed 20-somethings. All the flashing lights, the techno music, the iconic advert. Wipeout is just as important as a certain Lara Croft was. It's human traffic in game form. This is the game that gave the PlayStation the image of being the system that you, Terry, played with your mates after a night out. You all go to the club, dance your nuts off, get a free drink off a girl you've tried to call, take a pill, do a line, have a fight, go back to your flat for more booze, and with your kebabs in your lap, you play Wipeout. And then presumably everyone fucks each other. It's the game for the jilted generation. A girl in Dave Perry ripped to the tits, Pete Tong banning it on Radio 1, Sarah Cox on the couch bleeding from her nose, Peter Sissons shaking his head on the news. Nice one, brother. Choose life. Son of life on white vinyl. Swallowing like you've just spat out a mouthful of sand. It's fucking Wipeout. You can talk so much about Wipeout as pop culture phenomenon, the controversial ad campaign that took advantage of all the above, the game as a gateway for many more people to get into the club scene and techno for themselves. But Wipeout the game is a futuristic speed racer that's simple enough to still work quite well. In actuality, most of the music was by longtime Psygnosis composer Tim White under his Cold Storage alias, but his tunes were spot on, and there were plenty of tracks dotted in from the likes of Left Field, Fluke and the Chemical Brothers. 2097 is of course generally regarded as the better sequel, but both of them clearly made their mark, and they sold loads. And yes, as with the likes of Tomb Raider, Wipeout was released on the Saturn II, but the combo of this game and the PlayStation just blew out everything else. It's only ever a good game at best, but Wipeout, in all of its forms, is massively important. I'm not sure how shocking that is for Americans watching, or how big Wipeout was over there. I fancy it pales in comparison to over here, where the games were gigantic and helped to establish the PS1 as the absolute king of the castle. I'm going to stop talking about it before I use the word zeitgeist. I'll save that for when or if I actually do Wipeout as a whole. Moving on to something else, let's have a look at Reflections' next big game. Another 1995 release, and a personal favourite of mine. The original Destruction Derby, one of my favourite PS1 games of them all. I also really like the sequel, Destruction Derby 2, but this, well, you just can't beat the simple purity of a track called Crossover, where the X and Y axes come together so gloriously every single time. This is a game about nothing more than cars beating the ever-loving shit out of each other. You don't need anything else, it's all so straightforward. You don't even need the proper Destruction Derby Dust Bowl mode. Just get on any one of these levels and start bashing. Simple, efficient, excellent. If you want to talk about great gaming on a budget, this absolute classic is still less than £1. As mentioned, Destruction Derby 2 is also very good indeed. It's graphically stronger, the tracks are longer, there's more things like jumps and cars just getting flat out chucked into the air. It's a truly excellent sequel, but the original is still just about the king. They're the last two games Reflections published for Psygnosis, and, on the whole, they're a bloody good way to go out. Of course, we'll be seeing the current state of all of these studios at the end. Plenty more in the first couple of years, and they're not all the epitome of cool or filled with destruction. Psygnosis published the Discworld series by Teeny Weeny Games, a series of point-and-clickers with great graphics, frequently annoying puzzles, and an all-star cast of British comedy. They've always been likeable enough for me, especially the first one, and they do the source material justice. Speaking of 2D games, the former Lionheart duo followed up Flink with a fairly well-received Lemmings spin-off called The Adventures of Lomax, with much the same graphical stylings and the chance to use classic Lemmings skills in a platformer. Not the greatest game, but certainly a lot better than 3D Lemmings. There's also the usual early attempt at 3D football, Adidas Power Soccer. An interesting attempt that's kind of crap but also not wholly serious, and which I'll be looking at more closely in a later video. Like Reflections, Bizarre Creations were also moving into the racing genre, a place where they would excel. They developed 2 official Formula 1 games, and here we're looking at the classic Formula 1 97. I loved this game then, and still do. It's absolutely held up, and it is still the best Formula 1 game by a country mile. Why? Well, it's got all the customisation you could want, you can make it as super hard or as helpful as you need to, but well, this is Formula 1 when it was still good, exciting, must-watch television. All the classic drivers are here alongside the crap ones. The driving is demanding and completely bullshit-free. There's no DRS or curves unless you put them on a high-score screen. The courses are as well represented as they could possibly be on the PS1, and a solid challenge that you actually have to learn because you don't get a radar. It simulates the classic look of the 90s F1 broadcast to the letter, and Murray motherfucking Walker is on the commentary. The current F1 sims aren't bad at all, they're actually quite good, but they are a simulation of a soulless husk of a sport that long ago lost its way. This is a simulation of an F1 that is still close to its pomp, and that's why it takes pole position. Late 1997 saw Psygnosis bombard the shelves with not one, but 2 new franchises, both of which were certainly memorable. First up, let's look at Jeep Police. This is one hefty production for the time, so many big cutscenes that the game needed 2 discs, and a game that runs quite well to boot. It's very impressive for the PS1, and tons of effort was put into the presentation. The game itself is one I remember fondly, and it is still kind of fun to play now, but it will always be brutally difficult. You've really got to have your eye on the ball and be able to lead the shit out of endless ships, ready to fuck your objective up to high heaven. It can be kind of annoying at times. Still, it's a memorable game, but perhaps not as memorable as the other one. Colony Wars is frequently regarded as one of the best series of games on the PS1. For the most part, it's a flat-out fun traditional space shooter, a sharp contrast to G Police's long cutscenes and sprawling urban cities. Not that this game exactly minces on the production value either. While PC folk had the likes of Homeworld to enjoy and lord over everyone else, this was certainly in the next best league, and well loved on the PS1. A great little space shooter with all the leading of enemies, laser fire, protection of convoys and astral dogfights you could want. It certainly gets tougher as you go along, although it's not as stupid hard as G Police thanks to the controls being that little less sensitive. Anyway, it's a great game, and one that is still very cheap too. Definitely another must-own Psygnosis title. Both of these games were successes from the off and would be followed by sequels, which in the main offer more of the same but with various tweaks. G Police Weapons of Justice takes the biggest jump forward. The game's got a whole new coat of paint, cities that appear out of wireframe, and even more dark than before. The good thing about this is that the game runs pretty much at full speed, although it can be kind of hard to actually see where you're flying sometimes. It's pretty good, especially if you like G Police. Colony Wars had two sequels. The one that I have, Vengeance, is great. It doesn't change a whole lot aside from bigger ships and bigger explosions, but then not much needed to be changed. It's a fantastic space shooter. I would go as far to say that something like Vengeance is a perfect starting point for the genre in general. In a genre where a lot of games are famously difficult, this one will teach you the ropes, how to lead enemies and whatnot. It's a really good game. As good, if not better, than the first Colony Wars. While there has been so many games already, I can't not cover Psygnosis' final multi-game franchise, Wall Cage. Hyped as the evolution of Wipeout, 1998's Wall Cage is another futuristic racer, only with some added features, like racing on the walls or on the ceiling, lots of power-ups and destructible environments. You could smash through buildings on your way to first place, but there's people in there. Who gives a shit? Wall Cage feels like quite an ambitious game, one that the PS1 almost cannot handle. It's certainly something I can see being real good on the PS2. However, both it and its 2000 sequel, Stage 2, did show a lot of promise, even if you always wondered if the game was perhaps a bit too similar to plain old Wipeout. Lastly, let's have a look at some one-offs. ODT, short for Old I Trine, is a third-person game set in some steampunk-style universe. It looked promising at the time, but I never got on with it, and I can't now either. The controls are very ropey, the camera grotesque, especially when you're aiming, and there's just nothing interesting about it at all. The whole game seems to be designed to be frustrating to the player, and I can't stand it. When people say that PlayStation games have aged terribly, this is exactly the type of shit they're talking about. But a big reason that a game like ODT has aged terribly is because it wasn't actually any good in the first place. Sentinel Returns is an updated version of Jeff Clemens' early 80s, somewhat unique computer game. It's a puzzler based on 3D spaces and not letting the Sentinel see you. People who know the original game will probably like this too. I don't have experience with it, so alas, I just don't get it. But that's no knock on the game. There's very few games like this aside from, of course, the original Sentinel. Overboard is something that's a bit easy to grasp. A quite cute and simple little game where you control a pirate ship through various maze-like stages. I've always quite enjoyed this one. It has a nice little old-school feel, and it's also just kind of cool to be playing around with a pirate ship, as it's something that you just don't see often in games. Not a major Psygnosis product, but a decent enough little game. Then there's Cyberdeck. This odd, colourful hoverboard-based game is okay, although it could have been good if it wasn't for some shit ideas. It is at least a bit quieter than a lot of the games here, and probably better than you would expect for something that's basically an advert for Vans trainers. And last of all, it would be silly not to mention that Psygnosis were the publishers in Europe for what is still one of the best loved games to come out of the PS1, the action RPG Zelda-alike Alundra. A damn fine game, of course. Everyone likes it, and everyone agrees that it looks great because it's in 2D. Still, there is a lot to be said for quite a few of the early 3D games here that aren't quite as fated as this one is. By this stage, Psygnosis were a pretty big deal. They had blossomed in the PS1 era, scoring hit after hit after hit. The name was utterly synonymous with quality. It was rare for them to release anything that could be considered a total stinker. If there had been any questions as to how good they could be at developing games, they'd answered them all by the end of the millennium. They'd expanded too, setting up a base of operation in Stroud that largely consisted of ex-Microprose employees, as well as in Camden to go with the Liverpool mother base. Despite being owned by Sony, they were still quite independent, with enough clout to even go ahead and release versions of Destruction Derby and Wipeout for the Nintendo 64. It seemed as though Psygnosis could do no wrong, and that the future was bright for them. However, things weren't exactly going to work out that way. It's strange, to be honest. Psygnosis' end can be looked at two ways, either long and drawn out, or quick and honourable. The truth is perhaps a bit of both, even if either way it was kind of a surprise. Gradually it appears as though Sony took over more and more at Psygnosis' towers, curtailing their independence. I guess they didn't want them to end up releasing games for the Xbox or what have you. As mentioned, Psygnosis were getting bigger and bigger at this point. There were now around about 400 employees working for the company all over the UK and Europe, and Ian Hetherington wasn't willing to stop there. He saw the company potentially expanding to double that amount. The high life of Imagine was still being lived in a way, mostly through cars, although certainly with the success to back it up. But in the end, not quite enough success for Sony. They'd put millions into the company, and they didn't think that they were getting quite enough back, and they certainly thought that Psygnosis were that little bit too independent. And so, in 1998, the executive board of Sony got together and voted to remove Ian Hetherington as managing director, cutting off Psygnosis' expansion at the head and moving to take over entirely. Hetherington found his feet again quickly, co-founding Evolution Studios, a company that he would also leave in 2007 when that was taken over by Sony. Whims like that one don't heal, presumably. Not long after this, the changes happened in earnest. In 2000, Psygnosis' publishing arm was merged into Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, and the developing arm was renamed to SCE Studio Liverpool, not only fully integrating Psygnosis into Sony, but doing away with the Psygnosis name altogether. This could, of course, be a good point to end it. From this point on, Psygnosis are just another developer in the Sony empire, and not anything like the company we've been covering. But of course, the demise of Psygnosis as a name would not be the end of Psygnosis' products. Well, a couple of them anyway. Sony went through Psygnosis' IPs with a fine-tooth comb, basically dropping any that weren't considered to be worth it commercially. And needless to say, they were ruthless. Some of the newest IPs that hadn't quite fully established themselves never stood a chance, putting an abrupt end to games like Roll Cage, a game not helped by being fairly similar to Wipeout. The ship had long ago sailed on both Lemmings and Destruction Derby. With both the original developers having moved on, it wasn't seen to be worth continuing with them. Shadow of the Beast was long dead and not seen as something worth reviving. G-Police, despite promising a third game at the end of the second, was unceremoniously axed due to poor sales. And even the critically acclaimed Colony Wars met its maker due, presumably, to unconvincing sales performance. Take away all of those, and you're left with just two: the official Formula 1 license and Wipeout. For the next 11 years, that would be all the games that Studio Liverpool would develop: 7 Formula 1 titles and 5 more Wipeout games. It would hardly be worth going through all of them, of course. The F1 titles in general were in the middle of the pack, neither bad nor good, eclipsed by a whole load of much more successful racing games in a wide variety of forms. Obviously they had their fans, but they would never reach the dizzying heights of the first 2 games made by Bizarre Creations. Maybe you can just blame Formula 1 in general for turning into unwatchable shite. Wipeout was of course the premier franchise, but gradually that settled into an ever-decreasing niche. Wipeout had benefited from club culture in the mid-late 90s as much as club culture had benefited from it. Without that, what you're left with is a series of good futuristic racing games, a couple of which were certainly critically acclaimed, like Wipeout Fusion on the PS2 and Wipeout HD on the PS3, but they stopped being big commercial successes. And so, there goes a decade of just being another cog in the Sony empire, until sadly in 2012, the hammer fell. Sony assessed their European studios in August and, after doing that, they decided to close Studio Liverpool. Just like that, the story of Psygnosis was completely over. Although it could be said that it had actually finished 12 years previously. I mean no disrespect to any of the games, but it's a bit like covering Bullfrog after they turned into EA UK and pretending that they were in any way the same thing. A couple of smaller studios split off from Studio Liverpool, both of which specialise in specific areas of game development, or more casual games, but that's about it, to be honest. Presumably a lot of other people found homes in Sony's other Northwest studios, like Evolution and XDev. Of course, there's a bit more to cover. The eventual fates of the many great companies that prospered under the Psygnosis empire, because hell, we've been covering all of them too. It's a bit of a mixed bag. DMA, of course, were the big success story. Their name was changed to Rockstar North in 2002, and with that they took the Grand Theft Auto franchise into the stratosphere. Are they all that similar to what they were? Well, perhaps not, but they are at the head of the biggest games franchise in the world, and therefore totally untouchable. The kings of the mountain. Reflections would switch to GT Interactive and start producing the Driver series, a rollercoaster journey in its own right from commercial success to absolute ignominy, and then back to respectable cult status. GT rolled into Infogrames, Infogrames became Atari, and eventually Reflections was sold to Ubisoft. They remain there to this day, and they usually play a collaborative role in the development of some of Ubisoft's biggest games. Their most recent game, Grow Up, was literally released all of a week ago. Traveller's Tales moved to Sega for a couple of years, where they produced Sonic 3D Blast and Sonic Park. A few years of bland shovelware followed, before the studio hit pay dirt in 2005 with the first LEGO Star Wars game. After being purchased by Warner Bros. Interactive in 2007, LEGO games are all that the studio produces, but they certainly make a fair bit of bank out of it. Of the big four, the bummer story belongs to Bizarre Creations. They continued to make waves in the racing genre, going from Formula 1 to Metropolis Street Racer, and from there to the Project Gotham Racing series, all hugely acclaimed. Not only that, but they also made the much-loved Geometry Wars series of indie arena shooters. For years they had a superb reputation, mainly down to almost never releasing a bad game, and then, in 2007, Activision bought them. In 2010 they released two games. Blur, another racing game, was again hugely acclaimed, and quite rightly because it was superb, but it didn't sell. And an original James Bond 007 game, Bloodstone, didn't sell all that well either. And Activision, being Activision and therefore being a bunch of absolute arseholes concerned with nothing but the bottom line, closed the studio in a heartbeat. An utterly undeserved fate. A lot of companies spun off from Bizarre, although notably a whole load of ex-Bizarre employees moved to Playground Games, where they would work on Forza Horizon, a spin-off series that is often considered to be the spiritual successor to Project Gotham. Of the ones who only did one or two games, some went on to greatness. Digital Illusion CE foremost amongst them, hitting pay dirt with Battlefield and getting signed up by EA to hit even more pay dirt with Battlefield, along with making games like Mirror's Edge. They're comfortably the second biggest dev studio to be previously linked with Psygnosis. Erwin Kluboffer and Henk Nybel, former Failure members who made the likes of Flink and Lomax under Psygnosis, have gone on to long and varied careers in the industry. Vivid Image had further success with Street Racer, but dissolved around 2002. Divide by Zero only lasted a couple of years and burned out in 1996, and so on. There's a lot of little stories, but the thing to take away from this whole video, and the reason why it focused on games so much, is the incredible amount of talent that passed through and was just at Psygnosis. The company nurtured not just one, but several of the most important games dev studios around. So many got their start from them, or they just passed through in their early years. At all times they were a perfect example of just how the relationship between the developer and the publisher should go. And a lot of that had to do with them still being developers themselves, because they knew the score, and they weren't just automatically interested in sales. They were interested in seeing what people could do, and always had an eye on the future. It's a philosophy that David Lawson introduced back in the days of Imagine, when he hired talented programmers not to direct them, but to allow them to be creative and put their ideas down, refusing to manage them. With some refinement, the same philosophy helped to drive Psygnosis forward into being one of the greatest software houses of the late 80s and the whole of the 1990s. In the end, I guess, they were almost too damn good to be allowed to live.
Not bad. Okay, thank you for watching.